The night Diana died, a single red rose lay on the empty throne beside King Charles. The world wept for the people's princess, but inside Buckingham Palace, one woman didn't shed a tear. She finally had what she waited 50 years for. In the summer of 1972, for the first and only time in his life, Prince Charles was free. He was 23, on leave from the Royal Navy, and the palace press office had nothing scheduled. No ribbon cuttings, no investitures, no forced smiles. Just long, golden days at Broadlands, the Mountbatten estate, where the river ran slow and the air smelled of cut grass and possibility. That was where he found Camilla Shand again. She was 24, sun-browned, barefoot, laughing at something her sister said while leaning against a stable door. When she saw Charles, she didn't bow. She lifted one eyebrow and said, "Back from saving the empire, darling." The word darling landed like a match on dry leaves. They had met briefly the year before, but now there was no one watching. No equerries, no ladies-in-waiting, no photographers hiding in the hedges. Just the two of them and a bottle of warm Riesling stolen from Lord Mountbatten's cellar. Camilla never treated him like royalty. She teased him about his ears, mocked his taste in music, told him his watercolors were sweet but a bit wet. When he tried to impress her with talk of architecture and the environment, she listened properly, head tilted, cigarette burning forgotten between her fingers. No one had ever listened to him like that. Not his mother, not his father, not the parade of suitable girls marched past him since he was 16. At night, they walked the riverbank. She let him hold her hand. Once, when the moon was huge and low, she let him kiss her against an oak tree and laughed softly into his mouth when he apologized for being clumsy. "You're allowed to want things, Charles," she said. "Even princes get to want." He wrote her letters that summer, long, aching pages full of things he had never told anyone. She kept every one. They both knew it couldn't last. He was heir to the throne. She was the granddaughter of Alice Keppel, King Edward VIII's last mistress, history repeating itself in the cruelest way. The courtiers already muttered that Camilla was fast, experienced, unsuitable. Her own father warned her that the royal family would never allow it, but for 12 perfect weeks, neither of them cared. Then came the letter from the Admiralty. 8-month tour, West Indies, immediate departure. Charles begged her to wait. She cried, but she was realistic in the way he could never be. "You're not allowed to choose me," she told him the night before he left. "You never were." He sailed anyway. While he was gone, the phone calls grew shorter. Her letters arrived less often. And on July 4th, 1973, Camilla Rosemary Shand married Major Andrew Parker Bowles at the Guards Chapel in front of 700 guests who all agreed it was the smartest wedding of the season. Charles received the invitation on a warship in the Caribbean. He went to the stern, alone, and threw the heavy cream card into the black water. Then he locked himself in the heads and was quietly sick. Years later, friends would say he never smiled the same way again.
By 1980, the palace was in full panic mode. Charles was 31, still unmarried, and the tabloids had started calling him the prince who can't decide. Behind closed doors, the Queen Mother and Lord Mountbatten drew up lists the way generals draw battle plans. The girl had to be Protestant, aristocratic, young, photogenic, and, this was underlined 3 times, a virgin. Lady Diana Spencer ticked every box. She was 19, shy, worked in a kindergarten, and blushed whenever Charles looked at her. When he visited the Spencer family seat at Althorpe that summer, Diana wore a see-through skirt in the garden, an accident, she later swore, and Charles noticed the sunlight on her legs. The press noticed too. Overnight she became Shy Di, the perfect fairy tale princess. Charles barely knew her. They had met perhaps 13 times. But the family closed in like wolves. His father sent a handwritten letter. You must propose now or ruin the poor girl's reputation forever. His grandmother invited Diana to Balmoral and declared her just right. Even Mountbatten, on his deathbed, whispered that Diana was the one. Charles felt the walls moving in. He took Diana to the riverbank at Balmoral, the same riverbank where he had once kissed Camilla under the moon, and asked her to marry him. She said yes instantly, eyes shining with what he mistook for love. In truth, she was dazzled by the prince, by the castles, by the idea of being queen one day. She had no idea what she was walking into. The engagement interview is still painful to watch. When the reporter asked if they were in love, Diana giggled, "Of course," and Charles added, "Whatever in love means." The cameras caught her face freezing for half a second before the smile came back. Camilla was invited to the wedding, of course. Royal circles are small and vicious. She stood in the congregation at St. Paul's on July 29, 1981, wearing pale gray and watching the man she still loved marry a girl who looked like a sacrificial lamb in 25 feet of ivory silk. That night, at the reception, Charles found Camilla in a side corridor. They didn't speak. He just pressed a small note into her hand. It said only, "I have never stopped." Then he walked away to cut the cake with his teenage bride. Diana noticed everything. She was already learning that her husband's eyes searched rooms for someone else. On their honeymoon aboard the Royal Yacht Britannia, Charles wore cufflinks engraved with two intertwined C's. Diana asked what they stood for. He told her, Charles and Camilla. She laughed, thinking it was a joke. When she realized it wasn't, she threw them overboard into the Mediterranean. Within months, she was pregnant with William, crying in bathrooms at Kensington Palace, and discovering that the marriage everyone called a fairy tale was actually a triangle with one side missing. And somewhere in the Wiltshire countryside, Camilla Parker Bowles read every newspaper story, smoked too many cigarettes, and waited for the phone to ring. It always did.
By 1986, the marriage was a corpse that everyone pretended was still breathing. Diana had given the crown 2 heirs, smiled for 1,000 cameras, and danced with John Travolta while the world swooned. Behind the palace doors, she was starving herself, throwing herself downstairs, slicing her arms with razor blades just to feel something other than the cold emptiness of a husband who didn't want her. Charles had retreated to Highgrove, his country house, where the gardens bloomed and the phone line to Middlewick House, Camilla's home 30 minutes away, never cooled. They spoke every day, sometimes 3, 4 times. He called her Gladys. She called him Fred. Stupid, private names that made the world disappear for a few minutes. Diana knew. She had always known. She found the photographs first, Charles and Camilla laughing together at polo, tucked inside his private diary. Then the letters, scented, intimate, hidden in a briefcase. One night in 1989, she waited until Charles came home from a meeting, smelling of someone else's perfume. She confronted him in their bedroom at Kensington Palace. "There are 3 of us in this marriage," she screamed, "so it's a bit crowded." Charles didn't deny it. He looked tired, almost relieved. He told her love wasn't something you could switch off like a tap. Diana threw a hairbrush at his head and missed. Then she walked out and never slept in the same bed with him again. But Diana didn't curl up and disappear. She weaponized her pain. She started wearing dresses that made the front page every morning. She hugged AIDS patients when the rest of the royals were still terrified of touching them. She walked through minefields in Angola in a visor and flak jacket and dared the world to look away. Every time Charles tried to control the narrative, Diana detonated it. And in 1992, she detonated the biggest bomb of all. A book appeared, Diana, Her True Story by Andrew Morton. The palace called it lies. The world read it in one weekend and realized every word was true. Diana had smuggled tapes out through friends. On them, she spoke of bulimia, suicide attempts, and a husband who loved another woman. Britain woke up and chose sides overnight. Charles's approval rating collapsed. Camilla was papped leaving her house and chased by photographers screaming, "Homewreckers!" Someone threw a loaf of bread at her car. She went into hiding. Then, in January 1993, the Camilla-gate tape leaked. It was 6 minutes of a late-night phone call recorded by an amateur radio enthusiast. Charles and Camilla laughing, whispering, fantasizing. The moment that still makes people flinch came when Charles said he wanted to be her tampon. The tabloids printed it word for word. The nation gagged. Charles became a national joke overnight. Diana listened to the tape alone in her apartment and laughed until she cried. For the first time, the untouchable heir looked mortal, and Diana, the hunted princess, had finally drawn blood. But the war wasn't over. It was about to get uglier.
August 1997. Diana was 36, free, and more dangerous than ever. She had spent the summer on the Mediterranean like a flame the paparazzi couldn't look away from. Barefoot on the deck of a billionaire's yacht, kissing Dodi Fayed in emerald water, laughing in Saint-Tropez with her boys. The photographs scorched front pages across the planet. For the first time in 16 years, she was living entirely on her own terms, and the palace was terrified of what she might say next. Rumors swirled that she was writing her memoirs, that American networks were offering 8-figure sums for a single interview. At Balmoral, the royal family watched the images on television and said nothing. Charles was quieter than usual, chain-smoking in the garden, staring at the hills as if the answer might be written in the heather. Camilla was staying at Ray Mill, her private house, deliberately out of sight. They spoke on the phone every night, voices low, both pretending the world wasn't burning. On the evening of Saturday, August 30, Diana and Dodi dined at the Ritz in Paris. She wore a black jacket and white jeans, hair shorter, eyes wary. She knew the photographers were waiting outside like wolves. She and Dodi decided to slip out the back. Their driver, Henri Paul, had drunk 3 Ricards at the hotel bar. The security cameras later proved it. The plan was to go to Dodi's apartment near the Arc de Triomphe, lose the press, spend a quiet night. They never made it. At 12:23 a.m. on Sunday, August 31, the black Mercedes S280 entered the Pont de l'Alma tunnel at twice the speed limit. The car swerved, hit a pillar, ricocheted, spun, and slammed to a halt in a cloud of dust and shattered glass. Diana was conscious for a few minutes. A firefighter who reached her first heard her whisper, "My God, what's happened?" Then she slipped away. In London, the phones began to ring. The British ambassador in Paris called the Queen's private secretary at Balmoral at 2 a.m. The message was short. "Very serious accident. The princess is badly hurt." Charles was woken 20 minutes later. He stood in his dressing gown in the cold Scottish corridor, repeating the same sentence over and over. "They're all mad, you know. All mad." Then he went to Camilla's room. She had arrived secretly the day before, and shut the door. No one knows what was said, but when he came out, his face was gray. By 4 a.m. Paris time, the doctors at La Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital knew she would not survive. Her heart had been displaced into the left side of her chest. The pulmonary vein was torn clean away. At 4:57 a.m., they stopped trying. Diana, Princess of Wales, was pronounced dead. Charles received the final call at 5:15 a.m. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said only, "I always knew they'd kill her in the end." He flew to Paris that afternoon on a royal jet with Diana's sisters, Jane and Sarah. When they wheeled her body out on a gurney, covered in a green blanket, Charles bowed his head and stayed that way for a full minute. On the flight home, he sat alone beside the coffin, the engines roaring, the cabin silent, except for the sound of a grown man crying like a child. Back in Britain, the country imploded. Floral tributes began appearing outside Kensington Palace before breakfast. By Monday, the piles were waist-high. By Wednesday, you could not see the grass. People queued for 10 hours just to sign a book of condolence. The tabloids that had hunted her for 16 years now screamed, "We are sorry," in 72-point type. And the royal family, still at Balmoral, still following ancient protocol, refused to lower the flag to half-mast above Buckingham Palace because there is no flagpole when the sovereign is not in residence. The silence from the Queen became a scream of its own. Inside the palaces, panic set in. Charles's press secretary begged him to say something, anything human. Charles could barely speak. Camilla, hidden at Ray Mill, watched the television coverage and chain-smoked until her fingers shook. Friends who phoned were told she was not receiving visitors. One later said she sat on the kitchen floor and repeated the same sentence for hours. "They're going to blame me for this. They're going to blame me forever." On Friday, September 5, the Queen finally came back to London. She walked along the flowers, read the cards that called her cold, and for the first time in 45 years on the throne, she looked afraid. The funeral was the following day. 26 white roses, one for each year of Diana's life with the royals, lay on the coffin. Elton John sang a rewritten Candle in the Wind, and half the planet cried with him. Charles walked behind the gun carriage with his sons, head bowed, the weight of a nation's grief and rage pressing down on his shoulders. And in a quiet house in Wiltshire, Camilla Parker Bowles turned off the television, poured herself a large gin, and waited for the storm to decide what it wanted to destroy next.
The morning of September 6, 1997, Camilla Parker Bowles made a decision. She would disappear. She sent her children to stay with friends, locked the gates of Ray Mill, and for the next 9 months barely left the house. Deliveries came to the back door. The curtains stayed drawn. When she did venture out, she wore dark glasses and a headscarf like a criminal on the run. The press camped at the end of her lane 24 hours a day, shouting, "Murderer!" whenever the gate opened. Her own mother received hate mail. Her sister was spat at in Waitress. Charles phoned every night from wherever he was hiding, Highgrove, Birkhall, St. James Palace, and begged her to hang on. "They'll forget," he kept saying. She didn't believe him. She read the placards outside Kensington Palace that said Camilla killed Diana, and wondered if she would ever walk down a street again without being hated. For 10 years, that hatred was the weather they lived in. Charles tried everything. He hired the best PR team money could buy. He took William and Harry to meet Camilla in secret, 4 o'clock on quiet Sunday afternoons, always somewhere different, always with bodyguards checking the hedges first. William was polite but cold. Harry, 15 and still raw, shook her hand once and then refused to speak. The boys blamed her. Everyone did.
In 2000, the Queen finally agreed to be in the same room as Camilla at a 60th birthday party for the King of Greece. She shook Camilla's hand for exactly 2 seconds and never looked her in the eye. It was progress of a sort. Slowly, painfully, the strategy changed. Camilla was rebranded from mistress to partner. She started appearing at Charles's side at tiny, carefully chosen events, a hospital opening here, a garden party there. The press was briefed that she was kind, down to earth, good with dogs. Charles gave interviews in which he spoke of non-negotiable love. The public mostly rolled their eyes. Then, on February 10, 2005, Clarence House released a single photograph. Charles and Camilla on the steps of Windsor Castle, both beaming, her left hand deliberately angled toward the camera. On her finger was a platinum ring set with a 1920s emerald-cut diamond surrounded by baguettes, the Queen Mother's ring. The caption was 2 words, "Engaged, finally." Britain exploded all over again, but this time the rage was tired. People had spent 8 years grieving Diana. They were exhausted. Some boycotted the wedding, some sent hate mail, most simply shrugged and said, "Let him have her." They married on April 9, 2005, not in a cathedral, but in a civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall, 20 people total. Camilla wore a cream coat and a wide Philip Tracy hat the color of oyster shells. The Queen did not attend the legal part. The Church of England still frowned on divorcees remarrying. But she came to the blessing afterwards at St. George's Chapel and gave a speech at the reception that stunned everyone. Looking straight at Camilla, she compared Charles's life to a grand national steeplechase and said, "He has overcome Betcher's Brook and the chair and all kinds of other terrible obstacles. He has come through, and I'm very proud of him, and so is my husband." Then she turned to Camilla and added, "And I am very proud of her too." The room burst into tears. The woman who had once hidden behind curtains was now the Duchess of Cornwall, second lady in the land. 17 years later, on September 8, 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral. Charles became King Charles III at the age of 73, the oldest monarch ever crowned in British history. And on May 6, 2023, in Westminster Abbey, under the same canopy where he had married Diana 42 years earlier, Camilla was crowned queen beside him. She walked in wearing Queen Mary's crown, refashioned without the Koh-i-Noor diamond to avoid colonial controversy. She wore ivory silk by Bruce Oldfield and carried a bouquet of myrtle, the same flower Diana had carried. When the Archbishop placed St. Edward's crown on Charles's head, and then the lighter, Queen Mary's crown, on hers, the woman the world had once called the most hated in Britain became Her Majesty Queen Camilla. The cameras caught King Charles looking at her during the ceremony, the same way he had looked at her across a polo field 52 years earlier, like she was the only person in the room. Outside, a few protesters held signs saying, "Not my queen!" Most people in the crowd just cheered, because time had done what love and duty never could. It had worn the sharp edges smooth. Later that night at the palace banquet, Charles raised a glass to his wife and said quiet enough that only the people nearest heard, "Thank you for waiting." She smiled the same crooked smile she had given him in 1972 and answered, "I always said you were worth it." And somewhere, in the long, strange story of Britain's most controversial king, the boy who was never allowed to choose finally got the only thing he had ever truly wanted.